You often get religious people that say, and not just Jewish people, that will say, I believe in this political position as a Christian, as a Jew, and they'll sort of try and say that their religious beliefs very clearly chime with their political orientation. I suppose my question is, do you consider Judaism to have a political orientation?
And what is it?
Yeah.
It's actually, you do see thinkers put Judaism in the liberal camp, in the conservative camp. I'll tell you, it's very, very fascinating. If you try to identify Jewish political philosophy and take the text that should give it to you, the Torah has a very little political discussion.
Yeah.
It's very much about limitation. It's that if you really want a king, make sure they're a bit limited, right? And make sure they can be taken to court and they have too much wealth, etc. And that's it. The worst, and then when it comes to the actual people wanted to appoint a king in the book of Samuel, and Prophet Samuel says, oh, this is catastrophic. And God says, don't worry, they're not rebelling against you, they're rebelling against me. But, it's like you're not quite sure which side of the coin you're meant to be on. And there's actually a very serious debate in the medieval commentators, the Abarbanel versus the Maimonides, the Rambam, as to whether the ideal structure is a king or the ideal structure is not, or whether it's better this way, that way. And I think part of that ambivalence is because at least one possible suggestion, certainly pre-Messianic era, is that the Torah doesn't view the political structure as really critical and primary. It views the society as critical and primary. And I think it's true of economic structure as well. You can find points that look quite free market-ish. You can find redistributive instincts. You can find lots of these things. Torah, and I believe most biblical books, will take political problems and narrow them down to relationship structures and societal issues. And that's what Torah really cares about. That's a very strong social philosophy. And that doesn't instinctively apply, or automatically apply, I should say, to political philosophy. Because it's one thing the Torah clearly measures and judges a society by how it treats its poorest and weakest. But that doesn't doesn't automatically say that, therefore, we need to create mass interventionist governments with mass redistributive programs. It might or it might not. Because the key is, what is a society doing? It's almost like if you have a choice between the government taxes loads of people and then redistributes it, but the average citizen doesn't care less about their neighbor. That's a much bigger issue in many ways than where everybody feels a responsibility for their neighbor, and maybe the government doesn't need to do as much tax-based redistribution. The Torah is always doing that. You'll see it in the book of Ruth. It begins with a statement, we're in the days of the judges. It ends with the birth of the first king. So you expect to see a political book, and the entire book is about hints at problems in the society and the civilization and its rectification at the end, and it narrows into the structure of relationship and the dynamics of giving, taking, receiving, and all these various issues. The book of Esther starts with a serious political problem and ends with a political solution. In fact, it even begins with a weak leader who becomes a strong leader by the end. But it's all transformed in the dynamics of relationships.
And what kind of social solutions does it offer?
The social solutions that these books tend to offer, although there's particular relationship structures, the book of Esther will focus on the need for authenticity. Esther will turn to Achashverosh at key moments and say, effectively, at least in the Talmudic eyes, stop playing this facade game, start to be an honest human being. I mean, the guy can't make a decision for about 6 chapters of a story. Every single emotion is prefixed with the Hebrew ka, which means like. He was happy, he was like he'd calmed down. And in the end of the book, he can have real emotions. He actually calms down, he actually does real things. But at the key moment when she says, there's a plan to kill us, and he says, what? Never heard of this. Who did this? It's preposterous. And she turns around and says, the man who's causing enmity and so forth, and then she turns as this, anti-Semite Haman. But she's looking him in the eyes, says the Talmud. She's saying, don't lie, don't play games, be authentic. And he gets up and for the first time in the story walks out, actually thinks for himself, makes a decision for himself, and suddenly realizes the destruction that's been done to him and his games of facade and illusions and nonsense. And, and therefore it's a quest for authenticity that is the prerequisite for relationship and good building of society. In the book of Ruth, I think, these are much longer chapters than discussions than a fireside chat, but it's the redefining that the poor person is not necessarily the nebuch, for want of a better word. But as Ruth says to her mother-in-law, the guy I looked after today, in letting him give to me, is called Boaz, and restructures. And that then restructures how the town starts to view everybody. And we need, in the end, it goes down to human dynamics and the virtue of humans in connection of relationships, and it goes to how societies care for one another. I'll give you an example.
And these are things, by the way, that means that no government bureaucracy could instate.
You can't instate. You may need a government bureaucracy, but it cannot replace society.
Right.
You know the difference between I don't remember who was the first to come up with this idea. Rabbi Sachs speaks about it a lot, so do others, that you can have a society based on rights and social contracts, and you can have a society based on responsibility and the sense, if not explicitly, of covenant. And theoretically, it makes no difference if I say you have a right to life, or I have a responsibility to not hurt you. You have a right to private property, or I have a responsibility not to cross over into your territory. But educationally wise, if you teach children you have rights, they learn that society or the country or the government owes them. If you teach them you have responsibility, they learn to think, what do I owe somebody else? A. B is another key difference is rights are a relationship between you and an abstract bureaucracy, a state, a governance. If I walk down the street and the pavement's not good, or there's a neighbor who's unwell and not being treated well, I say, oh, this terrible government, this terrible council. If I live in a world of responsibility, I walk down the street, maybe I can't repair the street, but I'll take responsibility to make sure someone is. If they're not well, I'll knock on the door and I'll care about them. And you cannot escape the need to build a society. And I think Torah has massive social philosophy and family philosophy and relationships philosophy and very limited political philosophy, because it's telling you, I think that's the message. It's like you might build whatever political system you need whenever you need it at different phases in history, but make sure you're getting society right.
And that's really things that communities and individuals are able to manifest.
That the states can't do. Now, of course, there's a messianic vision, but even then the word king, melech in Hebrew, is not the primary word for a political power. That's moshel. Even in modern Hebrew, memshalah, like government of Israel. Power. Melech and malchut is always about king, and kingship is about integration of the many into something greater than all of them. It's like, instead of individual pieces, to build an entire body, like a human body, where each piece has a different role to play and together build something greater. So that's the messianic integration at the end. And the integrator does that. But along the way, and certainly, in our phase of history, I'm not convinced there is a political view, but there is very much a social view, and that's much more important.
To stay up to date with the latest JCV content, if you're on YouTube, click subscribe below the video and the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, click the like button, and under following, click see first.